All right, so I'm going to click to, well, let's go back to the data set. Very short, small data set here. And I've got the response date, impact survey type, their housing situation, whether or not they're a homeowner or a renter, health insurance status, confidence as a business owner, satisfaction with the state of your business, your personal life. So these three are the ones that are related to looking back at the past 12 months. How has this changed for you? Also added gender identity and your average monthly household income here. All right, so I'm going to go through and build the pivot tables. I apologize if this is a bit repetitive, but it's nice to just, sit through this and build it one step at a time. And so for each of these sections, I've, selected 3 items I wanted to review. So the first one is number of responses. To add a pivot table, I go to insert pivot table. And again, I've already named my table as table so that I can easily reference it. And let me just zoom in just a tad here so y'all can see. For this one, I just want a total number of responses. So I'm just going to pull record ID. And then I'm going to insert one for impact survey year. And this is just, again, a personal preference of mine. I like to see the responses on the left and then my count on the right. And you can also update this. I know that I will be keeping these as count of. You can actually change this and change your values so that you can do percent to total. When you create a pivot chart, your pivot chart will show whatever data shows up in your pivot table. So if you do percent to total, it's going to show percent to total. If you do a count, it's going to show count. So just an FYI there, depending on how you show, depending on the data that you show, that's what it's going to look like. And then I'll repeat that for pretty much all of this. For response date, you'll notice that there are other rows that pop up. I just want the year in which they completed the survey. So I'm going to actually remove quarters and response date, just so that I keep it simple there. Now over to household income. Oh, sorry, insert table. Average monthly household income and my values. Okay, so I actually want to group my pivot table because I don't want to see every single individual household income. So I'm going to right click and click on group, and then you can change your interval and your grouping. I'm going to start at 1, so I get the positive household income. Sometimes people don't fill out income. And then change my interval so that it's changing by $5,000. And click OK, and then you'll see that change. I also don't want a sum. I want to change this to a count, so I can just right click and summarize my values by count. And so that's just going to tell me the number of responses within that range, right? Same with housing situation. This is just another table. And then health insurance status. One thing I want to note as I'm building this out is you don't also want to overwhelm your dashboard. I like to keep things between 7 to 10 items on a dashboard because then it just becomes overwhelming visually as well as for your audience, right? So you want to just showcase items that you think are important for them to know, which is why I selected 3. Our impact surveys have a lot of questions on them.
And Linda, we've got an interesting question in the chat. Maybe just illustrate if
Sure.
you want to throw in a percentage to one of these.
Yes.
How would you go about doing that?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. All right, let me scroll over and add this last table, and I will do that. Okay. All right, so if you want to add, so let's say you wanted to change this into a percent to total, all you have to do is right click and change and select show values as, and then you can do percent of grand total, column, row. If you have multiple items within a pivot table, that's where the column and the row become important. But for this purpose, since we're just doing a percent to grand total, and that's what I'm going to select. And then it should change that. I like to just see whole numbers. If you want to add another column, you can do that by just selecting this and selecting your field and then pulling it into the values. And then it shows up as confidence as a business owner 2, and you can actually change that so that it is account and show values as no calculation. Hold on. Oh, it's because I'm formatted as a percentage instead of general. So then now you have the number of responses as well as the percent to total responses within the same pivot table.
Awesome.
Mhm.
Hopefully that helped answer your question.
Yeah. Actually gonna just remove this guy. We'll just keep it as percent to total. All right. Okay, so, oops, I scrolled up too far. Okay, so now that I've created my 9 pivot tables, I'm actually not going to create a pivot chart for this because I just want to keep this as a KPI number and just have it on my dashboard. But for each of these, you can create a pivot chart. So all you have to do is click within the pivot table, and at pivot table analyze, a new tab will show up. You want to select pivot chart and it will automatically create a chart for your pivot table. Let me just zoom in a tad. So yeah, the Microsoft Excel will automatically create a chart for you. You can go into the design tab and design as you see fit. You can change the colors. You can even change the chart type to like a pie chart, any other kinds of charts that you want to show. One of the things that I'd like to do, because at RMFI, we like to keep our branding, our fonts, our colors, things like that. I actually create templates and then I can apply them to the pivot chart. So to do that, like let's say you really like this chart that they've created for you, you can just click on save as a template and then it'll save somewhere on your computer. So I'll just put this as template 1. And then you'll always have that template available under the template function. Well, hold on. I think it'll show up once I refresh. But you'll notice that I also have other templates created here. I always put my initial in front of things. So the LX, I've got a horizontal bar chart, a vertical bar chart, and a donut chart that I like to use over and over again. We also have an RMFI demographic chart that I like to use when we are talking about race and ethnicity. So with that being said, one of the things that I wanted to highlight, just my personal preference for charts, is I like to remove a lot of things. So I like to remove grid lines, sometimes axes, sometimes labels and legends. I wanted to keep it very simple so that my audience sees visually the data, right? So sees the difference between 89 versus 50 and can see the number 89 and 50. That's just my personal preference as for data visualization, wanting to keep it simple for the audience. Unless, of course, you want to see trends over time. So you want to see the axes or you want to see the grid lines. But for the most part, for my audience, we're just wanting to keep it simple. So I'm going to make this into a donut chart. And you'll notice it's very simple, and using our RMFI colors as well. Under survey response, I'm going to make that into a pivot chart, and then I'm going to change this into a bar chart. So I'm going to click on design, go to change chart type, and then select my template as the vertical bar chart. And then you'll see kind of, how all that grid lines and things just go away because I just like to see that data right there in the bar chart. With the household income, I'm going to create a pivot chart again, and then just apply one of my templates. And let's do a horizontal bar chart. The reason why I like this is because we have several response answers here. So just wanting to see that all written out. And then click design, change chart type. And then for these 3, I'm just going to do a percent to total, a donut chart. One of the things that I was going to bring up also with Excel is just, it is a pretty manual process. So I apologize if I'm just clicking places, but it is, once you get the hang of it, it goes pretty fast. All right, so I'm going to go through and just change the titles. That is section. And even though I'm building this in this tab, we'll move them eventually over to the dashboard tab.
And Linda, once you finish working through this, Caitlin asked, how did you get the templates to begin with? And she mentioned, I don't see donut chart listed as an option. Maybe just like illustrate that.
Yeah, of course.
Caitlin, thank you for the question.
Yes. Okay, so sometimes it's the type of Excel that you have and what kinds of charts can show up. Let me just delete this guy. I can, because I don't think I can create two pivot charts. Okay, so I go to design and then under change chart type under pie, I have a donut option. I think depending on which Excel you have, it might not show up. And that's where my donut chart shows up. And then within that, you can edit as you see fit. Let me move that. And then change your all the elements that you want, do a quick layout, percent to total and things like that.
Oh yeah, and Linda, just remind me, I've done this before, but how do I save this? So I assume that I've done all the things. How do I save this bad boy as a template?
Yeah, that's a good question. So once you have, and you created what you wanted, you want to go to, change chart type and then save as a template.
Okay. Oh, thanks.
And then you can click on manage templates. I have a lot of templates here as well. And then I believe because, oh yeah, it did show up. Sometimes it takes a while for it to show up again as your template, and then you can just apply that.
Cool, thanks.
Yeah. All right, so now that I've got these 8 graphs, 1 KPI, the next thing I want to do is create slicers, right? So a slicer will help filter these pivot charts and pivot tables because it's linked to pivot tables. So within a pivot, just click on a pivot table. You want to click on pivot table, analyze, and insert slicer, and then insert timeline. Let's do the timeline first. So when you insert timeline, it's going to look at your data set and select any columns where there is a date. So response date shows up because it's the only date column here. But if you have like a start date or end date, both of those can show up here as a timeline that you can create. So I'm going to click on response date. And then you'll notice, let me just zoom in here, that it automatically selected months for me. I really don't want to see months. I just want to see years. So you can, in this right corner here, select years, and then it'll pare that down to just the years. The next thing I want to add for our pivot tables as slicers are, let's say, gender identity. So we want to see male versus female versus non-binary entrepreneurs. And then our impact survey type. So did they graduate 1 or 2 or 3 years ago? So to do that, again, click on any pivot table, go to pivot table, analyze, and then insert slicer. And then you can actually select more than one slicer. These are all the columns within my data set. And so I'm going to select gender identity and impact survey type. Of course, you can select any other slicers that you think are helpful in building your dashboard. All right. So I'm just going to click on one. So let's say I'm going to look at female entrepreneurs. You'll notice that only one pivot table changed. And this is kind of an annoying thing with Microsoft Excel. unless I think I can change the default setting, but it's because I built it originally for this pivot table, it's just going to change this pivot table. And so now what you want to do is report the connections for your slicer. So to do that, click on your slicer and then right click and report connections. And then you'll notice the list of all my pivot tables and only one is selected. So you have to go through and select all of the pivot tables so that when you click on a slicer to filter your data, you're filtering across all pivot tables. Now, of course, in the dashboard, if you only want to change data for like 3 pivot tables, 3 graphs, you can do that. Just make sure that you're selecting the right pivot tables that you want to filter. And I know my pivot table names aren't helpful, but you could also rename your pivot table so that you know which pivot tables you're selecting. And then you have to do that for all of the slicers as well. So again, you probably don't want too many filters for a dashboard, just some relevant things for your audience. And then same thing with the timeline, report connections, and then select all the pivot tables. All right, and click OK. So now you can see that the data changes as you are changing the slicer. Right. All right, so now I've got my graphs and I've got my slicers. I'm going to move them over to my dashboard. And I'll jump into Google Sheets in a second. But one of the things that I found with working with Google Sheets is that everything has to stay in the same tab for some reason for it to work. But with Excel, you can move it to a different tab. I'm just going to cut everything and put it in here and then move things around so that they're in the right section. All my slicers here. Move them around. And then I want my survey response date, impact survey, year, average monthly household income down here. And let me grab the other pivot tables. Pivot charts as well. Again, I'm choosing not to show my data, my pivot tables on my dashboard, but if that's something your audience wants, you can always have that as part of your dashboard as well. Health insurance status goes up here. Confidence, satisfaction. I'm missing one. Did I leave it? Hold on. Yep, it's all the way over here. Okay, cool. All right. Okay, so I'm not going to, okay, it does bother me a little bit, but I will try to keep them as even as possible. And then the only other thing that I want to add over here is my count. And so I'm just going to copy that guy and create kind of like a mini KPI based off of this. And then let's fold this and make it bigger, center it. Okay. So now I've got things in the right places. And yeah, the last thing I want to share is I like to go to view and remove my grid lines so that I don't see the grid lines. And then as you are selecting your slicers, the information changes, right? And so one of the things that I want to highlight as you're doing this is you'll notice, let me just click on female 2022 responses. You'll notice that, for example, average monthly household income, I don't see all the ranges. I only see the ranges in which there's data. So what you want to do, if you want to see all of the response answers within a pivot table, you actually have to change the settings within the pivot table so that you can see all of the answers. And so to do that, you want to go back to my pivot table. I'm going to keep it still filtered by female entrepreneurs. And then you also notice here on my average monthly household income, I don't see every single range. So to do that, you want to click within the column of row labels, right click on it, and then go to field settings. And there's an option here to say show items with no data. And so even though there's 0, it's still going to show up both on your pivot table and on your pivot chart. So if I go back to my dashboard, you'll see that 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 chart has changed to reflect the data that's on the pivot table. And sometimes it's important because my team likes to see all the response answers just so they can see what the total, like what all the answers are available for an entrepreneur to answer. So then that data changes and shows up even if there's zero response for that answer. So housing situation, you can see like there's only one entrepreneur who's non-binary. So if I want to, I can right click on that and then field settings and show items with no data. And then that should change that. So then that keeps it the same, consistent, right, across all of the pivot. Oh, sorry, all of the slicers. All right. And then it's pretty easy from here if you want to print it. Just make sure that you're selecting the filters that you want to select. And then, you know, noting that somehow probably in your file name, things like that for the audience to take away. But the cool thing about this is that you can just keep adding data to your data set, refresh your pivot tables, refresh your pivot charts, and everything should refresh with your new data set as you add more. Any questions before I jump into Google Sheets?
Hey, Linda, I had one fun comment.
Yeah.
So if you click, go back to your data set. So I just wanted to flag for folks, okay, so you formatted this as a table. And so when everybody was going through and Linda was like creating a pivot table, she typed in, what's the data I want? Well, I want the data from the table named table. One time I had an Excel file that totally broke on me because I had taken other data, converted it to a table, and it thought all 1 million rows or whatever were part of that table. So just be thoughtful, like if your data isn't formatted as a table and then you convert it to being formatted as one, be thoughtful about where it ends. When you add data to the bottom of the table, it's going to expand. But if for some reason Excel thinks that all of those blank rows are part of your table, your file size balloons and gets to be like completely crazy and unmanageable. And it was like so frustrating. I'm like, why is my file failing? What am I doing wrong? So just wanted to share that as a lesson learned. As a person who doesn't do this probably as often, even as Linda does, I was really thrown by that.
Yeah, no, definitely. Sometimes I don't format as a table for that reason, so that I can select the data set and just do a named range versus creating a table. So yeah, definitely a good point there. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to jump into Google Sheets. Google Sheets is a bit quirky, I will say. It doesn't have totally all the same functionalities as Excel, but it can replicate it in some form. So there are some quirks that I will point out as we're doing this. So again, I've got my data set and then I've got my dashboard tab. I don't have a separate pivot table tab because I haven't figured out yet. I don't think it's actually possible in Google Sheets for you to create like a graph. A slicer without being on the same tab as your pivot table for some reason. So what I've done here is on the left side, I have all of my pivot tables created. And then on the right side, I have my dashboard created. So then I just grouped these rows so that I can hide them from the team if they're looking at this data. And so I've already gone ahead since, we've got some, just to work a little bit ahead and created some of the charts and things like that for my data set. One of the things that I will say that's a limitation of Google Sheets is the kinds of fonts that you can use. My organization, we use Lato and it's like our font, but even though it's a Google font, I actually can't use it in a chart for some reason. Just some of the functionalities are a bit quirky. So like copying a graph, you actually don't have templates for charts. You just have to copy it and then change your data that you want to reference, things like that. So I'm going to go through and create a couple pivot charts, and then I'll copy some of the charts just to replicate what we saw in Excel. And so I only have two left here, satisfaction with your business and then satisfaction with your personal life. So to do that, I'm going to move my Apple menu. Hold on. Okay. Click on Insert Pivot Table. And then from here, I tried to name my data range, but it will actually suggest the data set. So that's the correct data set that I want to reference for my data range. And then I want to insert this into my existing sheet, which is this tab. And just click on it, make sure you select the cell, click OK. Now, the pivot table editor looks a bit different, obviously from Excel, but it is easy to use. You just drag and drop what you need. So for this, I want satisfaction with my business as my rows, and then I also want them as my values. And then on this side, I want satisfaction. Oh, I'm still in the pivot table editor. So I have to click out of that and then click insert pivot table again. All right, and then insert to my existing sheet. I want F38 and click create. And so I want confidence as a business. Nope, no, I don't. I want satisfaction with personal life as my rows and then as my values as well. Same thing here with Excel. You can change this. Right now, my default is just a simple count, but you can change this to % of grand total. And then if you were doing like satisfaction with personal life and then impact survey year across the columns, you can do % to rows, % to columns, just depending on how you want to analyze your data. I'm going to keep it simple for % to total here. And I like to remove a couple, yeah, just to make it whole numbers. Okay. So with that, you'll notice that for all of my charts, my pivot tables, I've removed the grand total, and I'll show you why in a second. I have to remove them because the charts are connected to the cells. And if I have grand total as part of a row, it'll show up as a data point. So I'll show you what that means in a second. So let me do this one. Click out, edit. Show totals. Okay. So over here is where I'm going to build. Let's say I like this template and I want to replicate it for my impact survey type. You can just copy and paste that. And then click on the 3 dots to edit it. And then I want to change my data range. So just delete that. And then go over to my impact survey type and highlight that guy. Click OK. And then I just like to click within the chart itself to update it. So impact survey year, sorry, type, because it'll keep all that, most of the information over. Impact survey type. Also want to copy this over for my healthcare status. And we click edit and then just change the data range. Again, this is because I'm not able to save templates or apply templates. So that's why I have to copy and then change my data range for a chart in Google Sheets. Just another quirky thing. And then change this to health insurance status. And then my 2 donut charts, I'm just gonna copy that one and then paste it again, and then change the data for each of these guys. The one thing that I do appreciate about Google Sheets is how you can see that it's automatically doing the alignment for me. That's not available in Excel, so you can make it, you can rearrange it so that it looks nice and evenly spaced. Oh, click on that. Change business. Click OK. Same thing here. All right. First, business, and then satisfaction with personal life. All right, so I created these charts. All of them look good. This is just a copy of the pivot table to create like a little KPI guy. And then next I want to add my slicers. Similar to Microsoft Excel, you want to just click within one of the pivot tables, go to data, and then add a slicer. The cool thing with this is that it already can be applied to all pivot tables, or you can unclick it. But if you want to apply it to all pivot tables, it's already an option. Whereas in Excel, we had to select, right, and report those connections to each individual pivot table. Here, you can just click apply to pivot tables. And then I want to do impact survey type, move that over there. And then you can actually copy this. And I think you can copy this and paste it. Nope, I can't. Never mind. So I'm going to go to data again, add a slicer, and then add gender identity as one of mine as well. So it does look a little bit different, of course, doesn't have a little menu option. And then in order to filter it, you want to click on this filter button, and then you can select the male entrepreneurs to see that. And then you'll see all of that information changes for each of the pivot charts. Now, one of the things that I wanted to highlight, you'll notice that under health insurance status, grand total shows up. And that's because in Google Sheets, you are selecting a specific data range, and I don't actually want to see grand total. And so that's why all of my pivot tables have removed the totals. So it's just a quirky thing again with Google Sheets, unless you do want to see the grand total. But for the most part, I don't want that to show up when I'm filtering for the data, if that makes sense. Okay. And then, so yeah, so that's Google Sheets. Again, you just have to play around with Google Sheets to get used to creating those charts and then creating the slicers. But the process is pretty much the same. You create your pivot tables, your pivot charts, and then add your slicers. And then, yeah, I don't know why this is, but I can't copy this into its own tab. It has to be within the same tab of where the pivot tables live. Okay, can you have slicers only point to some charts instead of all charts in Google Sheets like you can Excel? I think so. Hold on. Click to edit slicer. So if I click apply to pivot tables, and then I'm gonna click on that and do year 3. I actually don't know what kind of data is changing. I don't know. Or maybe it's changing my data set. No, it's not. Actually, don't know. That's a good question. Because I've only ever had it apply to all pivot tables. So I don't know exactly the functionality if I unclick it and I click just one over the other. But I can look into it and get back to you. Okay. Okay, so sorry, that took a bit longer than I expected. Just wanted to highlight some benefits and challenges before I open it up for some questions. So some benefits to using Excel and Google Sheets is that it is generally easy for those who are comfortable with Excel and Google Sheets. And then also for your audience who's already, if they're already comfortable with Excel and Google Sheets as well. It can be pretty easy to set up once you have your pivot tables, pivot charts in place, and then you can continue adding data to the data sets and then refreshing your tables as needed. Some of the challenges though, it is a pretty manual process of setting up. So like you've seen today, lots of moving things around, making sure that the data is what you want it to look like in both the pivot charts and the pivot tables. The functionalities aren't as robust as say Tableau or Google Data Studio in that, like, let's say you wanted to add multiple pieces of data into one dashboard, things like that. You could, your Excel file size would just become really big. And then the dashboard most often stays as an internal document, right? I guess you could, if you wanted to, host this on a web page, things like that. But it, for the most part, I would say we've been using it internally to review data or share out data, but not necessarily putting it on our website or things like that. I'm sure you can, like Google Sheets, right? It's on the Google Suite, so you can probably link to it, but it's just not as embeddable as like a Tableau dashboard or Google Data Studio dashboard. So But yeah,
Rad.
now just open up for
Linda.
questions. Yeah.
Yeah, would love to hear what questions are coming up for folks here. And I totally appreciate those who already wrote a question in the chat, but I'm sure somebody's got something. So invite you to type in the chat or come off of mute. Let's hear it. Okay,
Refreshing.
Caitlin, you mentioned refreshing pivot tables. How do you do that?
Good question. Okay, so let me just copy this data, I guess. So let's say I want to copy this data and I want to add it to this table. Like you were saying, Paul, I would have to go under data. Let's see. I have to reorient myself. Data. And then because my table is only so far. So I'm going to go to formulas, name manager, and then I'm going to edit my table. Okay, so my table is there. I feel like so, well, hold on. I'm just gonna highlight this and
Linda, I think it might be where it says 33,200 in the bottom right. It almost looks like you can drag that down. I wonder if you can just manually drag the table down.
You're right. I can. Because I was thinking of manually doing that. Okay, so once you add that data, you can manually update your table that way. If you just have it on a tab, you can change your named range if you've named your data set. Okay, and then from there, your pivot tables, you just click on a pivot table. Under pivot table analyze, you'll click on refresh. And all that is now at 145. And then everything else should update because it's connected to your pivot tables. So once you add data to your data set, click on pivot tables, pivot table analyze, refresh. You can also change your data source too, but it's already connected to my table, which I have extended. Thanks, Paul.
Yeah, for sure. And I had a question related to this in Google Sheets then, because essentially you build all these things and it sort of names, it's like through row 142. Well, if you add another 50 rows of data, you just have to go in there and like click on every pivot table and change the bottom, change the last cell.
Yeah, I think so. It's so let's say like let's add 20 more rows at the bottom and update this. It is, I would say, a bit more manual because I have to change my data set to J44 and then do that for pretty much all of the pivot tables.
Cool. Cool. Rachel, that's an interesting question. Okay, do you ever have to suppress data to protect people's privacy? If so, how might you do that using pivot tables and slicers?
Okay, so one of the things that I already did in my, like if you didn't want so like I've already de-identified my data by just using the record ID, but if it had like first name and last name.
Yeah, and Rachel, maybe do you want to like come off of me and maybe explain the situation, because I think I know what kind of situation you're talking about, but you can describe it better than I can. Oh no, Rachel, I don't think we can hear you. Maybe that's why you put that in the chat. I've seen, like CDPHE, for example, be like, oh, well, we're not going to show data for a zip code unless we have at least 5 responses. To say, okay, on a per demographic category basis, we're actually going to introduce like a null value or introduce like an asterisk instead of showing the value if it's below a certain amount.
Okay.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Oh, yep, we can hear you now.
Okay, yeah, I changed my microphone. So yeah, we are a state intermediary that supports programs across the state and have talked about sharing dashboards with them where like everyone who we're supporting could mess with the data on their own. But some of the counties are really small and don't serve that many people. And so if we're sharing demographics, like there's a Black family with a college education who's divorced in Moffat County or something, like there might only be one. So, but in a statewide data set, you wouldn't see that. But once you're drilling down, you might see that. So just wondering if you've thought through that situation.
Yeah, that's a good question. I have not thought through that, but I think there is a way where you can do your field settings and you can change it so that it only shows, like you were saying, Paul, data for a specific, if it's like 5 and above. So I believe there is a way to do that within your pivot table. I just don't know off the top of my head what that is.
Yeah. That's totally fine. We could follow up afterwards. And
Yeah.
Rachel, one thing that was coming up for me, I was just doing this for something else too. Like you could actually just build, like you could essentially have a copy of a table where it's like, okay, maybe it's the table or the pivot table, either one, it shows the data as it is from the data set on the left. And then there's sort of a formula, a copy of those pivot tables where it essentially says, if n is less than, something else that you say, show the data, otherwise show like star. Just essentially have like a copy of those tables sitting next to it that has like an if then formula. It's a little kludgy. I think if there's something within a pivot table that would probably be better, but I've done the latter sometimes, and it's worked okay.
Yeah. There's also within the pivot table, you can also filter it so that you can hide selected items. Oh, sorry, not hide selected items. Filter it so that you can do your value filters. So like if you want your count to just show if it's greater than, let's just say 25, and then it's just going to remove the anyone that's 24 and below. That makes sense. So you can already filter that out, and then that will show up on your dashboard.
Cool. Thanks for the question, Rachel. That's a good one. What other questions are coming up for folks? Anything? One more question from my point of view, Linda. I guess, like, do you have any strong feelings of like, will you generally lean towards Excel? Will you generally lean towards Google Sheets? Like what sort of influences you in, I guess, like making that decision? Because it sounds like your team uses both pretty often.
Yeah. So I lean towards Google Sheets if I'm sharing it out to other teammates, because only a few of us have Microsoft Office, like the paid version. So I lean towards Google Sheets for those, I guess, external to my department. But if it's anything that I'm doing internally between me and my supervisor, I keep it to Excel. Most of the time because I'm more well-versed in Excel, and I feel like Excel just has better functionality.
Yeah, for sure. And I've definitely gotten into I actually think when we did a project together, I built something in Google Sheets. And I was like, why can't I find this font?
Yeah, I know.
Because you're limited to, like 10 or 12 fonts in a chart specifically. Like fonts can exist in the cell, but it's what are the chart fonts, like the access titles and all that. So that's just an interesting limitation, I think, for folks to keep in mind.
Yeah. And especially if like my organization, where we do have like a branding that we like to keep to, things like that, it is important to keep that brand integrity.
Totally.
Yeah.
Totally. Cool. Okay, last call for questions from anybody else. I hope that y'all have been learning something useful here. Going once, going twice. Okay, awesome. Well, everybody, give some virtual kudos to Linda. Thank you for the tutorial here. That was wonderful. Very well put together, and yeah, super actionable. I learned some tricks that I've never learned in my many years of excelling. So yeah, this has been awesome.
Yeah.
Let me see. I think other really quick announcements. So, and I'll send this out in an email afterwards. I remember to start the recording. I started the recording a bit late, but hopefully we caught most of it. So we'll share a recording out with y'all afterwards in case you have any other colleagues that are interested in this. So we've got a couple upcoming events I want to highlight. Okay, so Our next event, it's actually a collaboration with the Colorado Evaluation Network. Rachel, thank you for making that happen. So I will be doing a similar presentation myself around lightweight dashboarding with Google Data Studio, which is sort of like it's the next step beyond doing this in terms of you can connect to live data sources, but the tool itself is actually free and it's a pretty low cost solution. And then David Napoli, so that's going to be on June 22nd. David Napoli is going to be doing an event on July 19th, going deeper on Microsoft Power BI, which is also a great dashboarding tool. So I think these three will, they're similar tools to accomplish similar things, but each have some differences. So just keep your eyes peeled for those. We'll send those out afterwards. I think we're doing May to June, July, and August. Our next happy hour is in August. So we'll be doing an in-person happy hour somewhere in the Denver area in early August. So those are our upcoming events. Would love to see you at some of those. If anybody else has ideas for an event or also wants to help organize stuff, feel free to reach out again to myself, Kelsey, who sends a newsletter, or Rachel, and we're happy to connect you. So I think with that, I think we did it, y'all. So I appreciate your time. Have an awesome afternoon. Thanks again, Linda. You rocked. I really, really appreciate it. So it was great seeing everybody here today. Take care, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye, y'all.